don't have to start it now. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our penultimate session for this conference, session number 5. And it's my privilege to introduce Professor Catherine Nell. I'm Professor Leon van Niekerk from the University of Fort Hare, and session 5 will be on the cumulative mild head injury in contact sports. And she's going to do a neuropsychological review of what we know about concussion. Specifically for sport conditions, it's concussion, but mild head injury is actually what that is. So, Professor Nell completed her master's degree in counseling psychology with a distinction from the University of Zululand, and she did a PhD in industrial psychology from the University of Zululand as well. She's a registered counseling psychologist and specializes in health, neuro, and sports psychology. She has got an interest in gender and sexuality studies as well. Although retired from full-time academic work, she is a research associate and mentor at the University of Limpopo. She's also teaching at the University of Pretoria this year. She's still supervising master's and PhD students, and Prof. Nell is also an NRF-rated researcher and has published quite a number of research articles and book chapters. She has presented at international and national conferences, both as a guest speaker and in her individual capacity as a psychologist. It's my privilege now to call Professor Nell to the podium and give her talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I apologize for the photo. At the time, and it was only last year, I dyed my hair. And then I decided, since I'm approaching 70 no, time to leave it. I would like to actually, first of all, pay tribute to the late Elliot Farner, a rugby player, coach of note, and who's left us too soon. And my condolences to his wife, family, colleagues, peers, and students. This has been a very well-organized conference. The VC, Prof. Balungu, the Dean, Prof. Ndima, the Honorable MEC, Ms. Nkonyama, sorry if it's spelled incorrectly, and the organizing committee organized by Prof. Niekerk. It's been wonderful. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Zibi from Finance, from the Humanities, who helped overview the spending, and the wonderful IT guy, Mr. Gary Ndlovu, who has helped me quite a lot because I'm not technologically advanced. Thank you. We will now begin with a brief overview of cumulative mild head injury in contact sports. This is actually a chapter that myself and Prof. Saraswati Govender, who's much more of an expert in the field of neuropsychology than I am. But I've always had an injury in cumulative mild head injury since I was at Rhodes in my honours year. Prof. Anne Edwards, she had ongoing projects and actually is a very respected expert in the field. And in my honours year, I was very lucky to be able to actually do research on cumulative mild head injury. So that was always interesting to me. Just to show you I have a sporting background, look at me. Oh, aren't I just young? I was a coach for the SA Junior Davis Cup, Federal Cup inaugural tournament in 1996. So, yeah, that was a very interesting thing. My daughter is Mary Jane Michaelides, right on the side there. She went on to do quite well in tennis. So, in this chapter, which the link will be on the the slides, and you can access and download the chapter if you would like to. And obviously, the slides will be made available. When we look at it, terms like concussion, mild head injury, mild traumatic brain injury, and cumulative mild head injury, often used interchangeably because of the different sporting codes, how when they're taken into hospitals, how you code them, also that depends. So it's not really broadly referred to always as the same cumulative mild head injury or MHI anyway. So that is the chapter, and there would be the link which you can get, as I say, if you request the PowerPoints. So the effect of cumulative mild head injury is seen in contact sports, particularly rugby union and football, or soccer as it's often referred to. More concussive injuries are reported every year in each age group. And we all watch, if we watch South African rugby, the balls, you see the forwards and you can see how fast they're moving and you can see those contacts. And they cause these head injuries. And they can lead to short and long-term cognitive deficits and possibly even promote illness later in life, dementias, etc. Who knows that US ALS was not, he must have always had it as a genetic part of his makeup, but perhaps even though he was a backline player, they still incur knocks. Who knows whether it was exacerbated by his rugby playing career? We can't say. And this is a brief review of some aspects of CMHI in rugby, football, and other sports. The background, what is a concussion? It's a traumatic disturbance of the brain function that has very complex pathophysiological processes. And multiple concussions are referred to as cumulative mild head injury. In other words, you can have many concussions over time. This is problematic in all countries, and particularly the rugby playing in South Africa. Always, do we remember, what was it, Rugby Sunny Skies Chevrolet? Sorry, no longer. And and Brifley, something like that. We played rugby. That's us. Many of us, we just watch it because we love it. But we stop our children playing from sometimes as young as 5. And they're not very heavy and they don't play for long. But they can have a little concussion, they can bump into somebody, and it goes unnoticed. It can go unnoticed forever, but it does happen. Rugby union and football, collision injuries and repeated heading in football. Various kinds of head injury, of course, from severe to mild. The most possibly psychologists, always particularly clinical, deal with the effects of TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, and it's a catastrophic event. It can be open or closed, the wound is open or closed, and there's always neural damage, anoxia, lack of oxygen, and it results in permanent cognitive damage. For instance, this can also occur in motor vehicle accidents or cerebral vascular accidents or strokes. The frontal lobes of the brain, particularly in soccer or football and rugby, are particularly vulnerable to damage. And damage can be caused through illness or injury. If one gets encephalitis or meningitis or strokes, you can incur injury to the brain as well as any kind of contact. The brain is not attached to the skull walls, and it moves when a head injury occurs. So the brain hits the bony protuberances of the skull. That causes bruising or bleeding, no matter how slight that is. There's always a little bit of bleeding, like when you bruise your hand when you hit something. It happens inside the brain as well. And you also get tangential injuries. So if it's an open head, something can pass through, or it can stay embedded in the brain. And bleeding can cause hypotension, that would be low blood pressure, For instance, gunshot wounds, severe bruising, contusions, and bleeding. So you have the injury at one side, brain hits the other side, so it's counter-coup injuries as well. Closed head injuries, various types. The most common is when the skull is injured and brain suffers acceleration and deceleration. Think of a car. Acceleration, and then it decelerates, hits the front, hits the back wall of the skull. Can happen in sport when skull hit by something, such as a ball or a bat or some kind. Most commonly occurs in MVAs, motor vehicle accidents, when a fast-moving vehicle stops. This can cause, depending on the speed you're going, mild to massive brain trauma. I still often, if I see a child, baby on its mother's knee in Pretoria in the traffic, sometimes I put my window down and say, please, go and sit in the back. Restrain your child. People still do this. Anyway, what can I say? Please don't. However, repeated blows to the head in sport can cause cumulative. So it's a cumulative injury, which can be chronic rather than acute. So there's no acute symptomology. It's chronic, and it doesn't really get noticed because it's not an acute injury. Okay, here we have the different lobes of the brain, which I'm not going to go into, but if you get the chapter, you can see what everything refers to. But I made my presentation too long, so I'm just going to skip that. So foreign object penetrating the skull is fractured, broken due to a foreign object, okay? Can you see there? So that could go through, or it could just be embedded, okay? But it's been opened. Here's a closed injury. So on the one side, the red indicates bleeding, and the other indicates the impact, the initial. But you see, because the brain moves, the impact is on the other side, just for interest's sake. It's a counter-coup injury. Mild head injury and its effects are still, even today, although there has, I must say, recently been a recognition of it more. But in terms of definition and classification, it is a bit problematic when you do research in the field, because a mild head injury refers to an injury where there is a loss of consciousness or a post-traumatic amnesia that is brief, and there's no noticeable, you can't see it, so it's no noticeable injury or pathology. Criterion used to define MHI in clinical practice is the Glasgow Coma Scale, or the GCS. That's also in the book chapter if you want to look at it. But when you use this in the sport context, it can be unreliable because of the fact that sometimes the symptomology is it's not acute. It's very chronic, and it's not noticeable. And sometimes the person doesn't even notice it themselves, to be honest. And certainly the coach doesn't. A broader definition of MHI includes different grades of injury, any periods of loss of consciousness for less than 30 minutes with a Glasgow coma scale score of 13 to 15 after the loss of consciousness. Any loss of memory for events immediately before or after the accident with a post-traumatic amnesia of less than 24 hours, and any alteration in mental state at the time of the incident. You know, that's quite common. You know, you might have a moment, and I mean, you hardly notice it, of double vision. Or you've all seen rugby players get up and they step backwards, a loss of balance. It can be taste or smell, and that may or may not be transient. It may or may not carry on any longer. It may occur then, or it may not. It may be over time. So, CMHI, increasing evidence that it causes more neuropsychological impairment as a result of neural attrition, neural death. And in later life, it can cause athletes problems. Cumulative damage to hippocampal cells can cause cognitive damage. CMHI that occurs over months or years is likely to cause neurological and cognitive defects. The effects of mild head injury and concussions in the sporting arena are likely to be cumulative. And some people still think that is not the case because you can't always see it in research that you do, but actually it's there, it exists. This has Thus, it has significant implications for athletes who play contact sports when you get repeated concussions and CMHI occurs, mild head injury. Research suggests that cognitive deficits are increasing as a result of CMHI. Here, quickly, I'm going to tell you that the alcohol consumption in South Africa is actually higher than anywhere else in the world, right? Rugby players, football players, and this goes to both men and women today, I might add, drink a lot of alcohol. Alcohol causes brain cells to die. The diet, we have a very fatty, high-fat diet with fries, fat on meat, fat in boerewors, etc. That has not a good effect on your health and life overall. You develop a fat around your internal organs, so it's not good, okay? And we have very high types of type 2 diabetes in this country, very high. So at the end of the day, with cumulative mild head injury and concussions, you have to take this into account. That is why sometimes in later life it is difficult to pin CMHI on any degenerative disorders. Okay, but it definitely plays a part. Concussive injuries, any head injury which causes headaches or changed levels of consciousness. A blow to the head has the immediate result of DAI, diffuse, spread over, diffuse, axonal injuries in the brain structures. This suggests that even short-lived impairment to neural function after a head injury, referred to as a concussion, can have effects over time. So this I'm not going to read out. It's going to take too long. But at the International Conference on Concussion, it was stated that concussion was a complex pathophysiological phenomenon caused by biochemical forces impacting on the brain. Okay, and you see it's caused by blows, speedy onset, and a brief impairment of function, results in neuropathological changes, and involves, but not always, it can involve a LOC, a loss of consciousness. Symptomology resolves usually in a specific sequence. It is characteristically associated with fundamentally normal structural neuroimaging. In other words, you can't see it. They later added to this that some cases post-concussive symptoms, PCS, can be protracted and persistent over time. When I want to read fast, I will stumble. Apologize for that. Now here we have just a picture basically of shock waves, how they travel through the brain and bounce back inside the skull. Impact causes burst blood vessels leading to bruising, contusions on the brain. So obviously if it's like a motor vehicle accident or some sort of very bad accident, you get more bleeding. In a smaller accident or a head injury on the field, it can cause to less bleeding, but it still happens. Relevance or prevalence of MHI is very difficult to ascertain worldwide because of the different names which I mentioned earlier that are used by medics' trauma rooms, as in the classification. Psychology and medic, we use ICD-10, and sometimes there isn't anything for a CMHI, there isn't. So you have to search through and see. And also, if the person isn't hospitalized, sadly, that data doesn't even make it in where you can actually seek it out. Okay, and I have the ICD-10 refers to maxillofacial injuries and scalp lacerations, but doesn't specify any type of MHI or CMHI, or maybe the latest version, I'm not sure, but that was how it was when this research was carried out. In South Africa, there are not many statistics. However, an incidence of 316 per 100,000 brain injuries were reported in the 90s. And it's estimated that today at least 89,000 brain injuries occur. That would be over a year, mostly TBIs, okay? That's traumatic brain injury. The mild and cumulative mild head injuries, you know, they're often not reported and very difficult to find. Rugby union has the highest incident of concussion in contact sport, with up to 50% of athletes, and frankly, pretty much more. The backline players often, it's not seen, okay? My son, who played backline rugby, said to me, you know, look how big we are. If you look when Nas Buerta played, Nas Buerta's, you know, a midget, really. Sorry, Nas, I didn't mean that. He's very small compared to most backline players today in their height and weight. And my son said to me, you know, we also get those injuries, but nobody really bothers about us. This was at school and provincial levels, you know. And at the end of the day, he's right. Look how big those guys are today, okay? So, and when you look back at any sport, and this would be any sport, the size, speed, and height, and, you know, the breadth, when I refer to size, of athletes today is huge compared to the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. So rugby union, as I said, well, and they say 50%. I would think more like 100%. Oh, maybe not. The wings are less likely, strangely enough, to be concussed because they're so fast. MHI includes primary and secondary head injury, contact force, major origin of injury, cerebral bruises cause focal to damage the brain tissue, resulting in tear or lacerations. Then there are particular theories that say how this occurs, which I'm not going to go into either. But, you know, they're pretty self-explanatory. But as I say, just download the book and you can read. Secondary brain injury occurs different lengths of time after the head trauma. This is a dynamic or ongoing process. As the symptomology evolves over hours and even days, after the injury, often causes more damage than the primary injury. That is why we say that anybody who suffered a brain injury and that, you really need to watch them at home if they've had a concussion, because sometimes the symptomology gets worse. You really have to be cautious, especially with children and teenagers. You can get, you know, lack of oxygen, lack of blood to the brain, and you get, of course, blood clots, which can cause terrible, it can cause strokes, frankly. SIS, or second impact syndrome, is less common, occurs when the athlete, rugby player or football player or any athlete, suffers a head injury before the first one is actually resolved. This can cause rapid brain deterioration and death because of uncontrolled intracranial pressure. Now that, when you see somebody who's died, which occurs rarely, but there are cases, it's often a second impact syndrome. And you see, whatever one says, there is pressure for these guys to get back on the field, and even the coaches in Super Rugby, in the really, they try to keep their athletes fit. But there's still cases where they go back on before it's resolved, and I know this for a fact. Pathophysiology, I'm not going to do this too much. MHI and CMHI, DAI, diffuse axonal injury, you know, cause the axons, they twist, they break. There's a picture, I think, coming up. It's a serious effect on executive functioning, you know, frontal lobe, and alters the speed of information processing, working memory, and attention span. So schoolboys who go back after this, sometimes their schoolwork suffers. And this usually happens, obviously, in secondary school, but it can happen in primary school too, much less likely because their weight and size, etc. It is postulated that DAI is involved in persistent PCS, right? So it's probably involved in cumulative mild head injury over time. There's a normal axon, twisted axon, torn axon, broken axon. So A is the normal axon, as you see. Those are, and of course the axons you cannot see, and there are how many of them, you know, in the brain, but that's what happens to them. Post-concussive syndrome, minor impacts to the head cause a pattern of self-reported symptomology. Often they will not self-report this to the coach or anybody else unless they have to, okay? But they will report it if you do research. 3 main symptom areas: cognitive, physical, and psychological. Symptoms usually resolve, and I say usually because they don't always, after a week to 3 months. But the chronic symptomology, this is where the issues arise, can be interactions at organic and psychological level. You can get dizziness, tiredness, headaches, Psychological, you don't concentrate well, memory loss or memory, you don't remember things as well. You're irritable, emotional ability, you show mood swings, depression and anxiety. There are various physical and neurological symptoms experienced by athletes, which I've just actually said. Poor problem-solving ability is one of them. And that is why often, even today when they know I mustn't go back on the field or pitch or whatever, they know they mustn't. They want to because their jobs depend on it, but also because their problem-solving ability is actually not as good as it should be. And it's also based on personality characteristics in athletes. Athletes are always, to a degree, the famous one, somewhat narcissistic. It's not a bad thing, and it's not that they have any type of disorder. It is that is who and what they are. It plays a small part in their personality makeup. So they don't think that anything bad can happen to them because they're built up from when they're children, etc. Also, sometimes it can be related to malingering and the possibility of financial gain. This happens often when athletes are older and they see their careers coming to an end and they develop symptomology and it's money related from their careers. It's very easy for psychologists to determine this, and it's a very small portion. So these are the diagnostic criteria, which I'm not going to go into again. Mostly in psychology we know them. And the return to play protocols must be well defined in both the professional sphere, which they are, but they're not so well defined in the amateur or school sphere or clubs and universities, to be truly honest. I have put those on separate document, which if you require, you can write and ask, and you will get this with the separate document, okay. Note that you get reduced alcohol tolerance, and I'm afraid that many athletes, not so much in the sport, in the professional field, but certainly in the amateur school and certainly the university field, drink alcohol a lot, which, as I say, kills brain cells, and then you've got post-concussive symptomology and CMHI. This is not a good mix. Okay, so these are the grades of concussions, the different types, and you can go through that. The grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then time of amnesia. And obviously, the longer you have the amnesia, then the more severe it is. That goes without saying. Neuropsychological sequelae, you can get PCS, 20% of cases goes beyond 6 to 12 months. Severe tiredness in 50% of individuals, which causes everyday living problems, certainly in any athlete and children and adolescents, yes. Psychological symptomology, such as depression, related to changes in the brain chemical makeup, okay? Children who experience MHRs are more likely to have impulse control problems and difficulty with high-level cognitive functions. So one has to be very careful. I would recommend that all children, adolescents, and everybody wear skull caps, not just forwards, backwards as well. It seems that this has never been made mandatory in the game for forwards or backline players, which is not good. And certainly it should be at school level and amateur level. So neurochemical changes occur up to an hour and up to 10 days later. Metabolic dysfunction, the hormonal changes in the brain after a head injury, if damage to the hypothalamus and or the pituitary gland occurs, can cause depressions, headaches, and tiredness. In severe TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, 60% of patients in research had abnormal hormone lessons. So acute sequelae will resolve in maybe 4 to 5 weeks. But there may be still problems with psychosocial capabilities, which may be mild cognitive issues, slower processing speeds, and deficits pertaining to tiredness and head injury. They should resolve by 3 months, but it's like everything else. The human brain is particular to each individual, with areas that are defined, sure, but people are different, and their recoveries are different for whatever reason. There's the pituitary gland, which has a wide variety of hormones that control the activity of the body's other hormone glands. So if we look at the mid-80s, people started looking at this, and it was money related in research and in sport. It's always money related, because some of the players, particularly in American football, which is a very high contact sport, were out. They lost a lot of money because their players couldn't play. Even when they went back in, they could see they were not performing like they should. So then the franchises said, okay, let's have a look at this, as did the National Hockey League in America. Then it filtered off to other countries. And I'll have to say that in South Africa, Professor Anne Edwards, or Shuttleworth Jordan, she was involved in this in South Africa from actually even before all of this started. So she's an actual expert, a real expert in the field. Now if you do baseline neuropsychological testing, it's the norm in some countries, not in others. So you can see subtle deficits because of cumulative mild head injury. That these relate to attention, arousal, alertness. Computerized tests are actually used often in practical application. In research, we use them, but we also use pen paper tests. The computerized tests are more accurate. Reaction time deficits and testing thereof is very important in athletes. A reaction time is the period in milliseconds it takes someone to react. As you get older, your reaction time sadly decreases. Okay, it's very sad. So if you have MRI, traditional neuroimaging techniques, it's not that great, but the newer ones, structural, they are more sensitive to structural abnormalities. But, the newer computerized tests, the old pen paper tests, they're actually very sensitive to diffuse damage to the brain. Particularly, I'm thinking of digits backwards and things like that. There's many different tests. So, but you've got to also be sensitive to cross-cultural difference as well, because it's an important part in cross-cultural judgment. So then you've got research that looks at the effect of CMHI on professional rugby players. A lot of it stems from Professor Edwards at Rhodes. As I say, Professor Shuttleworth Jordan. It's the same person, in case you don't know, all right? So rugby players, particularly forwards, showed deficits in verbal, working, and visual memory, as well as visuo-perceptual skills. So they wouldn't be catching the ball as well, as compared to the non-contact sport controls. This was researched by ANSA in 2000. In the rugby group, it was also found that rugby players displayed more cognitive deficits than backline players because they get knocked on the head more often. Some other South African research, which looked into intellectual deficits in schoolboy rugby players, found no significant correlation between reported head injuries and intellectual dysfunction. But then again, they might not, because all research is a moment in time, and sometimes it takes time for these deficits to show. In 2001, I think that was mine actually, I looked at schoolboy rugby players at St Andrews. One came in, I can't remember his name, he weighed 115 kilos. He was a schoolboy, he went on to play professional rugby, I might add. They showed that the rugby forward group had more variability on a battery of neuropsychological tests as compared to the rugby backline players and hockey groups. Missing the E there. In other words, if you show more variability on tests overall, there are more issues in that group, we can say. Working memory and visuospatial processing skills were more impaired in the rugby forwards than the rugby backline and hockey playing group. Yeah, Partington now. Partington is my maiden name, which nobody can ever remember. So here we have Shuttleworth Edwards, Shuttleworth Jordan, and Edwards. She reports that both schoolboy and adult rugby players at the national level had less capability on visuomotor processing speeds tests post-rugby season. It was postulated that this was probably due to unreported concussions or the cumulative effect of mild head injuries. It was also reported that rugby forwards who engage in more contact than backline players showed more cognitive deficits than backline players post-season, which a lot of research has now shown. In 2010, Gardner et al., this was not in South Africa, found that rugby players who had suffered multiple concussions were more likely to display cognitive dysfunction. This was not supported by this is my son's research in schoolboy rugby players using computerized testing, but it was a very small sample. And it's also possible that schoolboys recover more quickly because of their age. They're more resilient, but it doesn't mean to say over time, because as I say, all research is at one moment in time. And that was a very small sample. This was another one, looked at a student of mine did, at CMHI in university players. It was found there was a significant variability on mean scores between frontline and backline players on verbal memory, concept formation, cognitive flexibility, working memory, and visual motor processing speeds. Again, showing that the forwards are more prone to concussive injuries and cumulative mild head injury. The rugby playing group in this research had poor scores also on the post-concussive symptomology checklist, which I would also like to thank Rhodes University, which I adapted. But it was from their original post-concussive symptomology checklist. And it really showed that the rugby players were more likely to have some level of depression. Insomnia, lack of sleep, not able to sleep, and anger were frequently reported. They didn't mind reporting it to us because it wasn't going back to their coaches. Interesting, because they didn't want any, but they were quite happy we reported it, not names, obviously. In Australia, in rugby sevens, this is males and females, 104 of the sampled players, 31 injuries occurred, 30%, mostly caused by contact at speed tackling. 50% of these were head, neck, and shoulder injuries. However, CMHI was not investigated, but I can assure you it would have existed. It was found that slower and less agile players were more at risk of injury, as were female players owing to their physiology. So slower and less agile, school children, adolescents, and club players, of course. It was concluded that more research was needed into this area. So the incidence in Australia of concussion in schoolboy rugby union players was 4.3 per 1,000, and that was mostly incurred through tackling. Risk factors were the game itself, which is brutal, and that many tackles were made at very high speed. In this particular study of 332 schoolboy rugby players, it was found that over a third of the injuries occurred were to the head and face, and overall 61 reported concussion. As this was a high incidence, 18%, it was recommended that prevention programs be put in place. An Irish study found that 5% of recurrent injuries to schoolboy rugby players were concussive in nature, and this was the lowest type of injury on the injuries they looked at. But it was also noted that it could be disastrous because the concussions occurred more than once, and then SIS, second impact syndrome, or the development of traumatic encephaly could occur. Encephaly in the brain, the brain then would swell and it could be problematic. In soccer players, which we say here, although it is football players, it's a designated, originally non-contact sport. This changed. It's now a contact sport. If you watch football, you'll see why. It has been reported that particularly in the amateur and semi-professional games, concussive injuries are often not reported as they don't want to be benched for 6 weeks or more. Head to post, and head to ball injuries are mostly involved. Although, a player can hit another player, but those are the most ones. And I say during a tackle, I mean a tackle on the feet, not a body tackle. A ball, by the way, that travels at horse speed at 83 kilometers an hour can hit the skull with a force of 116 kilometers an hour. A full-powered kick hits the skull at 200 kilometers an hour. And people think that this doesn't cause cumulative mild head injury. Well, it does. In 1989, research that they used ECGs then of 12 football players saw that 12 football players out of a sample of 37 had slightly abnormal or abnormal ECGs as compared to 4 in the control group. That's very high if you look at that. An early Norwegian study found that football players, self-reported symptoms, inability to sleep, poor working memory, dizziness, and headaches after repeatedly heading the ball. Anybody who can get hold of a football, feel how heavy it is, and then just see if you'd like to be heading that. These results supported a study in the 90s where 55% of female and 54% of male football players, these were Olympic level, reported concussive symptomology after hitting the ball. These findings supported earlier research that 2 out of every 10 football players had abnormal EEGs after 15 minutes of play. Thus, concern for CMHI in youngsters playing and heading the ball from a young age, it is concerning. Though, I'll go through this quickly. A study in 2000 found no acute cognitive deficits in a sample of male and female football players. Conversely, in 2001, a study did find cognitive dysfunction. A 2016 South African study using a football playing group with a non-contact sports control, volleyball, used computerized testing that found that pre-season volleyball players had a faster reaction time than football players. Could be due to chronic cumulative mild head injury. I don't know, that was a PhD student of mine. On simple reaction time post-season, there were no significant differences between the groups. In fact, both groups had better results post-season, interestingly. Hey? This is because they do drills and reaction time training, which improved and developed their reaction time. Because when we got that, we thought, surely that's not right. And then we thought about it, and we looked at the drills they did, you know. However, on a PCS, post-concussive symptomology questionnaire, over 25%, a quarter of them, as compared to 6% of the volleyball players, reported symptomology, such as headaches, attentional problems, memory problems, irritation, nervousness, and anxiety. I have to say, this is probably exacerbated because these were university students, and they do drink. And that is why sometimes it's very difficult to pin things on one area. There are multiple areas involved. Another 2016 study looked at elite male football players who suffered a concussive injury, and they were more likely to incur another injury in the same year. This is unclear why. Why would they have that? But the researchers thought it might be due to inherent personality characteristics. Soccer players, famous ones, football players, I should say, have particular profiles, and you can see that many are extroverted and they like to be the center of attention. Perhaps, sorry, football players, but the youngsters may emulate this on-pitch behavior. Okay, we're getting to the end. So sorry it's so long, recent literature from CMHI and other sporting codes, combat sports, usually mild to moderate. The risk factors depending on the code, depending on what martial art, the age, weight, discipline, experience, and gender. Cricketers, very small. Between 1870 and 2015, there were only 36 reported, but 5 resulted in a fatal injury and 9 resulted in the cricketer no longer being able to play. Concussion in this area is much harder to diagnose, but medical professionals say, I mean, you've all seen the helmet being hit when people are batting, and in schoolboys and things, sometimes they can get hit on the head or by balls that are traveling fast if they're too close to the bat, okay? But it's much less so. American footballers incur many cognitive injuries, and thus CMHI. Thus, they're at risk of non-resolving cognitive deficits. Ice hockey players, the same thing. 2020 report into head injury to rugby found, among other things, they play a role in early onset dementia. In the 79 years of age and those over, those who had more than one concussion did have worse cognitive function. It sounds odd, but not many people live that age, but they do. And it happens. 23% of elite rugby players had abnormalities in the wires or axons of the brain. So basically, in South Africa as well as internationally, much research has been done to neuropsychological sequelae following concussive injury. Vital research in this field. You need to have clinical management, rehabilitation, education of athletes, etc. And I certainly hope someone young will take over this type of research in the country. because it's really vital and necessary. I would also like to say that COVID, a lot of younger people and children had COVID, and that might have long-term effects on the brain and might affect how cumulative mild head injury is incurred. Well, thank you very much. It was a bit technical, I do understand, and I do hope that it made sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nell, for a very informative session on concussion and informing us about all the relevant research that has been done so far. I want to just touch on, while we're waiting for questions, just to touch on the practical part of this. How would a coach who in a training session or in a match when there's not a medical officer nearby, because often this happens, or even when the athlete got the concussion off the field, coming from home or whatever, how would a coach be able to identify what symptoms could a coach look at? Because you don't want to put this child at risk. And even in a game, when a coach has to make a call whether I'm going to play this child or not, what kind of guidelines or advice is there on a practical level for a coach to make decisions about playing someone or not when they don't really have access to the medical information? Maybe just something on that.
If a child has reported that they've had a concussive injury at home, you see, often they will not show any symptomology. They might be tired, but that can occur, naturally headache, and they would have forgotten the dizziness or anything at the time. If they report it, you are conservative always. If you see it happening on the field, which at schools there's often no medics or anybody around, you take the player off and you bench them for 6 weeks. You bench them. If you have, and if we think of previously disadvantaged area, there are often no medics on site. Or perhaps there are medics that do a quick look, oh no, you're fine. If you see that happening, and this is in any form of the game, you take them off. There are guidelines. I think in the chapter there are guidelines, but it was, you can't go through the rehabilitation. It would have been too long. But that's what you have to do. Be conservative. All children, adolescents, in my personal opinion, forwards, backline players in rugby particularly should wear skull caps because it helps cushion the blow, literally. And I would definitely advise that. But the main thing is, don't think, oh, the child's all right, can you see, what was it the old days? You see one finger. How many fingers do you see? One. Okay, fine, you're right. Go back on and play, keep going. No, be conservative. Mummy and daddy will be pushing. Oh, but she's fine. It's fine. Send him on or her. She's great. Send her on. Do not do that. Because will over time become problematic. Not then, not there, over time. And that is what you need to think of. The child's health and well-being, obviously now, but the medium to long term, because otherwise it's going to be an issue. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Thank you so much. There's also a question on the floor from Mr. Herman ter Blanche.
Good morning, everyone. Herman ter Blanche from the Academy of Sport. Prof, thank you. Very well done on an informative topic. I think it's a topic that we're not always familiar with. And I think there needs to be a greater awareness, in terms of specifically what you said. My question is regarding boxing, both open style as well as professional boxing. Maybe I should squeeze this in. As you would know, Eastern Cape is the mecca of boxing in South Africa. Even the recent team selection from South Africa, we've got more than 50% of our boxers going to the Zone 4 as well as the World Champs later this year. I just thought I'll make you aware of that.
Wonderful news.
The question is, are you aware perhaps locally in South Africa or abroad perhaps of any studies, research and statistics that's available on head injuries in boxing? And I think there's a great concern out there in the boxing fraternity, you know, that our boxers, our promoters, our coaches are not aware and educated enough to handle and to prevent long-term injury. Maybe just your views on that.
I haven't done research into boxing injury. There has been research, mostly overseas. The reality is most boxing head injuries are not cumulative mild head injuries or mild head injuries. They're moderate and they can be traumatic. People that die, and you see that, still today, you see people who die in the boxing ring, professionals and amateurs. That's usually because of second impact syndrome. They haven't recovered from the previous one. All boxers, but they're not going to, but certainly at the amateur school level should wear, they have also skull cap things, okay? They should wear them. But in my opinion, the sport should not allow blows to the head. Whether this will ever happen, I don't know, because it does. You know, you get hit, the speed, the impact, then they fall on the floor. I mean, many boxers develop dementias early in life, earlier than normal, shall we say, senile or other types of dementia, because of this. It's an absolute tragedy, and I'm sorry to say that it's not a sport that should allow being hit on the head. It just shouldn't. Knocking people out or semi-conscious or whatever, that is barbaric. I'm sorry, boxers. I'm sorry for the sport, but that is my opinion. You have your own, and that's fair. So to make the sport safer, you have to ensure that skull caps are specially designed, that surely you don't allow these massive blows to the head. I mean, you know, blows to the body can also be good, but they don't incur the same amount of damage. And certainly the sporting code, I know for a fact that they have evolved over time, but it is still continues to be a problem, more so in the amateur arena, because it's often unregulated. And today, of course, you know, there's a move towards that. What do they call it? You know, like that boxing where they do bare fists, something or other. That's another thing. Or the one where they involve different parts of the body in a cage. That is actually barbaric and should not be allowed. Period. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions for now? Yes. Surely one of those topics that can generate a lot of conversation, especially with not just contact sport, with also collision sport. Correct, yeah. Very serious. I think we're learning quite a number of things through research about concussion and mild and even moderate and severe head injuries in sport, from which we can learn how to adjust rules and how to protect our athletes a bit more. So I hope that is being introduced more and more, especially in boxing. I mean, just knocking someone out is because of a brain injury that you knock someone out. So it's quite severe. There's a question there.
It's not a question, it's a comment from Bethiel Solombo. They say yes, telling the truth, Professor, but it's putting a perspective that parents put a lot of pressure on the athletes. Even if they're injured, they force them to train.
Look, in every sport you get, actually today the majority of parents are what we call problem parents. School teachers know about them. In sport, from tennis, which I was involved in for many a long year, and rugby, which I watched, there are problem parents. They stand there and shout on the sideline, you know, and it's terrible. You know, it's really awful. One has to feel sorry for the children, females, girls and boys, that the pressure, and it comes firstly from home. It's vicarious living. The parent didn't achieve as well. They want the child to do better, or the player was a Springbok rugby player or sort of half-noted provincial player. They want their children to do better, and that's the pressure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. We can say so much more about it. We are at the end of this session. The next session will start at 12 o'clock. And it is session 6, our last session, Positive Thinking in Sport, with Marietta Klaassen. And we will see you then. Take care.